Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about the greatest horror anthology ever created, which is actually two horror anthologies. But I do think it's the greatest, and I thought I would talk about it now. It is Horror Mayhem, a fantastic reading event devoted to horror, created by the Bookish Bryants a few years ago to celebrate short horror fiction. So, horror fiction that includes novels under 250 pages, and novellas, and novelettes, and short stories, all that stuff. And when you're reading short horror fiction, very often you're delving into anthologies. So, I thought I would just make a video about what I think that is the greatest horror anthology ever, which is actually two books. And if you think that this has actually, I don't think this horror anthology has ever been topped. But if you think it has, let me know. And put your choice for the greatest horror anthology down in the comments. I'd love to see it. For a long time, probably the greatest and most influential horror anthology was this one. This is Great Tales of Terror and the Supernatural, edited by Herbert A. Wise and Phyllis Fraser, which came out in the 1940s. It was very influential. A lot of people who got into horror and started creating stories and novels and films of horror read this book. It was a great book. It is a great book. Great Tales of Terror and the Supernatural. For a long time, this I would consider to have been the best horror anthology. But in the late 1980s, after the horror boom had struck, another horror anthology came out, which was pretty great. And that was The Dark Descent, which, yes, I have talked about before. And this ended up being actually two anthologies and not just one. But this was the anthology that came out in 1987, edited by David G. Hartwell. And Hartwell has done a lot of anthologies, science fiction anthologies, fantasy anthologies. He's done a lot of work. But this horror anthology was just, it was something. It's a major anthology. And like I said, I don't think it's ever been bettered for what it was trying to do, which at the time, Hartwell felt that horror literature had transformed over time to being a genre that was mostly written in the short form. Most horror had been published for a long, long time as short stories, shorter fiction. But by the time this anthology had come out, it had transformed itself to a genre that in fiction was mostly publishing novels. A lot of that has to do with the publishing industry itself and how these kinds of stories were published. You could say the same thing for science fiction and other stories that were published mainly in the pulp magazines and in magazine form for years and years. And then the paperback book showed up, and you would get more stories like that published as novels. The same thing kind of happened with horror. Novels became what was in demand by readers. And so horror had to transform into a genre that was longer, that told longer stories. And you will still have people to this day say that horror can't be done in the novel form, that because of what kind of stories and the mood and atmosphere you need to create in horror, people will still say you can't do that in a novel. You can only really succeed in a short story, despite massive evidence to the contrary. You of course can do horror very effectively in the novel form, as has been proved time and time again. But at the time that this book was coming out, this was an observation that Hartwell made, that this was short. There were still short stories being produced, of course, but certainly not as many. And yeah, the novel had taken over. And he felt it was time to look back over all of the years that horror fiction had been created and make a definitive anthology that covered all of the ground that horror had covered over the decades. And make a definitive horror anthology that would cover the evolution of the horror story. And that's how that's how this book came about. And he did a spectacular job with this volume. Unfortunately, it only almost accomplished its mission, I think, because there were some stories that were pretty important to the horror genre that he had to leave out just due to space. And so he had to make his own judgments about what could go in and what couldn't. It's the kind of thing every person who puts together an anthology of this kind has to deal with. There are always going to be stories that you have to leave out. Unfortunately, in this case, there were some pretty important stories that he couldn't fit in. And this is a big anthology. This is over 1,000 pages. So there's a lot in here. Unfortunately, this was the days before we had anthologies like this. This is the Weird, which I've talked about before, which, you know, is massive and double columned and could easily fit like everything Hartwell wanted to put into it. But, you know, they hadn't made anthologies like this quite yet at the time. This is 1987. But still, there's a lot in there. But eventually he did have to come out with a second anthology, which was a companion volume to this one, which I think together these two books do the job. The second anthology is this one, Foundations of Fear, which isn't quite as long, but really it is a companion to this. So together, these two books, I think, do accomplish the mission of covering all the ground that he wanted to cover and putting in all of the major stories he wanted to put in. You will still find stories that I'm sure readers would think would belong in here that are not in here. Even I could think of a couple. But mostly, I think it accomplishes its mission. And it's done. This original one was published in an interesting way. You had this book, The Dark Descent, but it also came out in 3 separate mass market paperbacks. Now, Hartwell had a theory about horror fiction, and he calls this the 3 streams of horror fiction, which I do not entirely agree with, but let's see what that is. Okay, so the 3 streams of horror fiction. This is Hartwell here in his introduction. Contemporary horror fiction occurs in 3 streams, in 3 principal modes or clusters of emphasis. 1, moral allegorical. 2, psychological metaphor. 3, fantastic. The stories in this anthology are separated according to these categories. These modes are not mutually exclusive, but usually a matter of emphasis along a spectrum from the overtly moral at one extreme to the near totally ambiguous, I cannot read, to the nearly totally ambiguous at the other, with human psychology always a significant factor, but only sometimes the principal focus. Perhaps we might usefully imagine them as 3 currents in the same ocean. So that's his theory, that you could handily fit all of horror into these three different streams of horror fiction. And so, yeah, he divided the book up into 3 sections. The first section, The Color of Evil. The second section, which is the Medusa in the Shield. And the third section is A Fabulous Formless Darkness. And it was those 3 sections that were originally published as 3 mass market paperbacks, which made up this anthology. And of course, you had the 1 volume edition. I don't think horror fiction is that neatly dividable, but that's just me. It doesn't really matter because the anthology is fantastic and you get just incredible stuff in here. Every writer that you think should be in here is in here, probably, especially if you put the 2 volumes together. In the first volume, in The Dark Descent, it starts off with Stephen King. I mean, it was the 80s. You have to start off with Stephen King. But the story they start off with is The Reach, which I think is a really good story. Not everybody loves that story, but I think it's pretty damn good. Then we have John Collier with Evening Primrose, which is interesting. We've got M.R. James with The Ash Tree, classic ghost and horror story writer M.R. James. There's a story in here, The New Mother by Lucy Clifford, which is amazing. And we also have, the people that we really need in here, like H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft's first story in this anthology is the Call of Cthulhu. But we also have Shirley Jackson, The Summer People. Got to have that in here somewhere, so there it is. Harlan Ellison, The Whimper of Whipped Dogs. Nathaniel Hawthorne. We also have Ray Bradbury's in here, of course. Sheridan Le Fanu. Carl Edward Wagner, the great Carl Edward Wagner's in here, and he's in here with Styx, which is, I'm not sure it's his best horror story, but it's pretty damn good, and that's in here. Styx was great. So Carl Edward Wagner's in here. Robert Bloch is in here with yours truly, Jack the Ripper, of course. Manly Wade Wellman, Charles L. Grant, and that's just in the first section. Everybody else who you think should be in here is in here. Stephen King makes an appearance, I think, in all three sections in this book. Robert Aickman's in here, Clive Barker, Edgar Allan Poe, of course. I mean, that's a given. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Richard Matheson is in here. Tanith Lee, Flannery O'Connor, Ramsey Campbell, of course. Fritz Leiber has Smoke Ghost in here, so you need that. Charles Dickens is in here, Walter de la Mare. Oliver Onions. I mean, the list goes on and on. I can't list them all, but there's a ton in here. But even with all of that, this was unfinished, really, because there was too much that was not in here that should have been. The thing that struck me immediately that wasn't here was Arthur Machen. Algernon Blackwood was in here with The Willows, of course, but Machen should have been in there with The Great God Pan, and wasn't. And so this showed up, The Foundations of Fear, which I really think just finishes what he started with this anthology. You could just say, well, that anthology was very successful, so of course they came out with a sequel. But really, I think this was a necessary volume to complete the project, really. And he considers it a companion volume. Hartwell does, and that's how he speaks of it in his introduction. And it does have stories that the other one doesn't have that it needed. The Great God Pan was the big one from Arthur Machen, but you also have Who Goes There by John W. Campbell, whose story, that story became the thing. It's a great story, and it really probably should have been in that first volume, but space. So it wasn't in there. But you've also got authors returning, like Clive Barker returns. Octavia Butler is in here with Bloodchild, which I'm glad to see was in here, because it kind of needed that. George R.R. Martin is in here with Sand Kings, because Hartwell realized you have to put Sand Kings in every anthology having to do with anything like this. So he fixed that and put that in here. This has H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. So that whole short novel is in here, which is awesome. So much great stuff in this one. This one isn't quite as long, but A Duel by Richard Matheson, that's in here. This isn't quite as long, but it does, like I said, it finishes the mission. And both of these are still, you can still get them. This you can still get new, I believe. So you can get a new copy of this, I think, on Amazon. This one, which I got on clearance for $2 at Half Price Books a few years ago. Actually, it was like 20 years ago. This one you can get, I don't think this is still being published, but you can get it pretty easily on eBay or something like that. It's not very expensive. So if you do have that one, you probably are going to want to get this one, because together they make up a fantastic horror anthology that I do not think has ever been bettered. So there you go. I will shut up now. I will catch you next time.